Story 1. Red snow murders. The blood in the snow was still steaming when I found the first body, which meant the killer had been here minutes before I arrived. Maybe he was still here, watching from the tree line as I knelt beside what used to be a traveling salesman from Anchorage, now carved open like a hunting trophy and arranged in the snow with ritualistic precision. My name is Detective Ray Collins, Alaska State Troopers, and they've been hunting the red snow killer for 8 months. 8 months of crime scenes scattered across 2,000 miles of empty highway, each one more disturbing than the last. 8 months of wondering if I'd been chasing a human being or something else entirely that wears human skin when it needs to blend in with civilization. The pattern started last winter along the park's highway. Travelers found dead at rest stops and scenic overlooks, their vehicles still running, their bodies positioned in the snow like mannequins in a department store window. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, no connection between victims except that they'd all been driving alone through the most isolated stretches of Alaska's highway system. What made these murders different wasn't just the brutality. It was the precision. Each victim had been killed with surgical accuracy, their wounds inflicted with knowledge of human anatomy that suggested medical training or extensive practice. But more disturbing was how the bodies were arranged. Always facing north, arms positioned at specific angles, surrounded by patterns carved into the snow that looked like symbols from a language that predated human civilization. The killer left no fingerprints, no DNA, no tire tracks or footprints that led anywhere useful. But he left something else. At each crime scene, carved into nearby trees or scratched into roadside signs, was a single word: hunger. Written in block letters using what appeared to be the victim, his own blood, dried to a rust-brown color that stood out against white snow like a brand burned into the landscape. They worked homicide for 15 years, investigated serial killers who collected souvenirs and psychopaths who killed for sexual gratification. But the red snow killer was different. His murders felt ritualistic, purposeful, as if each victim was selected for reasons that went beyond random opportunity. As if he was feeding something that required specific types of human sacrifice to maintain its strength. The breakthrough came when I started mapping the crime scenes geographically. 7 murders across 8 months, scattered from Fairbanks to the Kenai Peninsula. At first glance, they appeared random, following no pattern except the killer's ability to find isolated victims on empty roads. But when I plotted the coordinates and connected the dots, they formed a perfect spiral centered on a location that didn't appear on any official map. Deep in the Wrangell Mountains, accessible only by a logging road that had been abandoned for 30 years. Satellite imagery showed the ruins of what appeared to be a research facility. Government records listed it as a Cold War-era military installation, decommissioned in 1987 and officially designated as environmentally contaminated and off-limits to civilian access. But unofficial records painted a different picture. Classified documents I accessed through law enforcement channels described psychological warfare experiments conducted on prisoners and volunteers during the 1980s. Research into sensory deprivation, behavioral modification, and what the reports euphemistically called enhanced interrogation techniques designed to break human consciousness and rebuild it according to military specifications. The facility had been shut down after what official reports described as a containment breach. 17 researchers and 43 test subjects had died in an incident that required hazmat cleanup and permanent quarantine of the entire area. But the death reports were inconsistent, describing injuries that didn't match any known chemical or biological hazard. Injuries that looked suspiciously similar to what I'd been finding at red snow crime scenes. 3 weeks ago, I made the decision to visit the abandoned facility alone. Against department protocol, without backup, carrying only my service weapon and enough supplies for a 2-day expedition into terrain that had been marked as hazardous for 30 years. I told myself I was following a lead. In reality, I was being drawn there by something I couldn't name, something that had been calling to me through every crime scene photograph and autopsy report. The logging road was barely passable, overgrown with vegetation that looked wrong for the climate. Plants that should have been dormant in October were still green and growing, their leaves an unusual shade that seemed to shimmer in peripheral vision. The air smelled of ozone and decay, like the aftermath of an electrical storm mixed with the scent of meat left too long in warm weather. The facility itself was a collection of concrete bunkers connected by underground tunnels, surrounded by a double fence that had been cut in dozens of places by something with claws or tools that left distinctive mark patterns. Warning signs in multiple languages covered every surface, but the words had been altered. Original warnings about radiation and chemical contamination had been scratched out and replaced with messages in that same block lettering I'd seen at crime scenes. Hunger feeds, hunger grows, hunger waits. Inside the main building, I found evidence that someone had been living there recently. Sleeping bags arranged in a circle around what appeared to be an altar made from laboratory equipment and human bones. Food supplies that included canned goods and preserved meat of indeterminate origin. Maps of Alaska highways with red pins marking every location where the red snow killer had struck, plus dozens of additional pins marking sites where no murders had been reported yet. The basement levels contained the real horror. Research laboratories where psychological experiments had been conducted on human subjects. Their equipment still functional despite 3 decades of abandonment. Video monitors displaying security footage from highway rest stops across Alaska, all recorded within the last month. Someone had been watching, studying, selecting victims with the patience of a predator that had learned to hunt with scientific precision. But the worst discovery was in the deepest subbasement, behind a steel door marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in Russian. Inside was a chamber that had been designed for sensory deprivation experiments, containing a single chair surrounded by medical monitoring equipment and what appeared to be surgical tools arranged with ritualistic care. In that chair sat the remains of what I assumed was the original test subject from the 1987 incident. Still alive after 30 years of isolation and experimentation, no longer recognizably human but aware enough to turn its head when I entered the room. Its eyes held intelligence that was simultaneously human and completely alien, as if whatever had been done to it in that chair had created something new using human raw materials. The creature in the chair had been transformed into something that could survive without food or water, that could withstand temperature extremes and physical trauma that would kill normal humans. But the transformation had come with a cost. It had developed needs that could only be satisfied through ritualistic murder, cravings that drove it to hunt along Alaska's highways with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting experiments. This was the red snow killer, not a human being driven by psychological trauma or criminal pathology, but a laboratory creation that had escaped containment 30 years ago and learned to feed its artificial hunger by killing travelers who would never be connected to an abandoned research facility. A predator that had been created by human science but evolved beyond human understanding. I should have called for backup immediately. Should have documented everything and turned the investigation over to federal authorities with resources to handle threats that existed outside normal law enforcement parameters. Instead, I found myself standing in that chamber, staring into eyes that held 30 years of isolation and artificial hunger, knowing that it recognized me as the person who had been tracking its feeding pattern across the Alaska wilderness. The creature spoke to me without moving its lips, communicating through methods that bypassed normal human senses. It told me about the experiments that had created it, about the researchers who had tried to weaponize human consciousness and accidentally created something that existed partially outside physical reality. It described the hunger that drove it to kill, a need that went beyond nutrition or sadistic pleasure to something more fundamental. It needed to feed on human fear and pain to maintain its existence in our dimension. But it also told me something else. The spiral pattern of its kills wasn't random. It was building toward something. Each murder was a component in a larger ritual designed to expand its abilities, to transform it from a single predator into something capable of creating others like itself. The red snow killer wasn't just hunting individual victims. It was preparing to transform human civilization into a feeding ground for artificially created predators that would make current crime statistics look like paradise. I left that facility 3 weeks ago, but I never really escaped it. The creature let me leave because my investigation had served its purposes, had helped it refine its hunting methods and identify weaknesses in law enforcement protocols. It wanted me to return to my job, to continue tracking its murders, to become an unwitting participant in the final phase of its transformation project. Since then, they've been receiving communications through official channels that I know are coming from the creature. Crime scene reports that describe murders I know haven't happened yet. Autopsy results for victims who are still alive. Evidence logs for investigations that exist only in my nightmares. The boundary between reality and the artificial hunger that was created in that laboratory is starting to break down. Tonight, I'm writing this confession before I return to the abandoned facility. Not as a law enforcement officer investigating serial murders, but as someone who finally understands that the red snow killer was never the real threat. The real threat was the hunger itself. The artificial need that was created by human experimentation and has been growing stronger with each feeding. The hunger that is now ready to spread beyond a single creature to infect others who have been exposed to its influence. The blood in the snow was still steaming when I found the first body 8 months ago. Tomorrow, when they find my body arranged in the same ritualistic pattern, my blood will still be steaming too. Because the red snow killer doesn't just murder its victims. It transforms them into components of something larger. Something that exists in the space between science and nightmare. Between human ambition and the consequences of trying to improve upon designs that were never meant to be altered. The hunger feeds. The hunger grows. And now the hunger has learned to replicate itself through anyone who gets close enough to understand its true nature. Story 2. Bethel Files. What they didn't. Report. The official report said John Leckett killed 4 people in Bethel, Alaska on January 19, 1985. But they never mentioned what made him do it, or why 3 of the victims were found arranged in a perfect circle around something that shouldn't exist. I am a retired state trooper who worked that case, and after 38 years of keeping quiet about what really happened in that remote village, I need to tell someone the truth before I take it to my grave. What the media called the Bethel massacre was just the visible part of something much darker. Something that turned a normal man into a killing machine and left evidence that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. Bethel sits on the Kuskokwim River, population maybe 6,000 people, surrounded by tundra that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where violence is rare and shocking. When the call came in about multiple shootings, I was part of the response team that flew in from Anchorage, expecting to find a domestic dispute that got out of hand. What we found was a crime scene that defied every principle of criminal investigation I learned in 20 years of law enforcement. John Leckett had been a respected member of the community. 43 years old, worked at the power plant, coached Little League baseball in the summer. No history of violence, no criminal record, no signs of mental illness or substance abuse. His neighbors described him as quiet but friendly, the kind of guy who would shovel your driveway without being asked and never mention it afterward. But on that January morning, something changed in him, something that turned a mild-mannered power plant worker into a methodical killer who moved through his victims with surgical precision, leaving behind evidence that still haunts the investigators who worked the scene. The first victim was State Trooper Michael Peterson, shot 3 times in the chest while responding to reports of suspicious activity near the power plant. Peterson was a good cop, experienced and cautious, but his radio transmissions before he died suggested he wasn't dealing with a normal suspect. His final words, barely audible through static, mentioned something about the lights in the sky and how they were making patterns that hurt to look at. We found Peterson's body inside the power plant, positioned face up with his arms spread wide, staring at a section of the ceiling where someone had carved symbols into the metal support beams. The symbols were precise and complex, definitely not random scratches, but they didn't match any known writing system or gang markings. More disturbing was the fact that the metal around the symbols had been heated to temperatures that should have been impossible to achieve with hand tools. The second and third victims were plant workers who had been on duty that morning. Both shot in the head at close range, their bodies arranged in specific positions around a piece of equipment that shouldn't have been there. In the center of the main generator room, we found what looked like a massive tuning fork, about 8 feet tall, made from the same unusual metal as the ceiling symbols. The tuning fork was vibrating, producing a sound so low it was felt rather than heard, a thrumming that seemed to resonate in your bones and make your teeth ache. When our forensics team tried to approach it, several officers reported feeling nauseous and disoriented, like something was interfering with their inner ear balance. We had to clear the room and bring in protective equipment before anyone could examine it closely. The fourth victim was found in Leckett's own house, about 2 miles from the power plant. His wife Sarah, shot once in the back of the head while she slept, but her body position suggested she hadn't been sleeping when she died. She was found sitting up in bed, fully dressed, with her hands positioned as if she had been writing something. On the nightstand next to her was a notebook filled with the same symbols we found carved into the power plant ceiling. The handwriting was definitely Sarah's, confirmed by comparison with her employment records from the school district where she worked as a secretary. But the symbols themselves showed a level of precision and consistency that suggested she had been copying them from somewhere else, reproducing something she had seen or been shown. The final pages of the notebook were different, filled with what looked like mathematical equations mixed with diagrams that resembled star charts or navigation maps. John Lekic himself was found dead in his backyard, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. But the circumstances of his death raised more questions than they answered. He was positioned in the exact center of a circle made from objects taken from inside his house. Furniture, appliances, personal belongings, all arranged in a precise pattern around his body with spaces between each item that had been measured to the inch. What made the scene even more disturbing was the condition of the objects themselves. Everything in the circle showed signs of exposure to extreme heat, with metal items partially melted and wooden furniture charred black. But there was no evidence of fire damage to the surrounding snow or nearby structures. Whatever had generated that heat had been precisely controlled, affecting only the items in the circle. The investigation that followed was the most frustrating of my career. Every piece of evidence led to more questions instead of answers. The tuning fork device couldn't be moved or dismantled because it seemed to be somehow fused to the power plant's concrete foundation. Attempts to turn off the vibration by disconnecting power to the facility had no effect. The device was operating on principles that our technical experts couldn't identify or explain. The symbols found at both crime scenes were submitted to linguists and cryptographers across the country, but nobody could decipher their meaning or identify their origin. They weren't related to any known human language or writing system, yet they showed clear signs of intelligent design and purposeful construction. Some experts suggested they might be some kind of technical diagrams, while others thought they could be religious or ceremonial in nature. But the most disturbing aspect of the investigation was what happened to the other investigators. Within 6 months of working the Bethel case, 3 members of our forensics team had died in accidents that seemed statistically impossible. Car crashes, drowning incidents, a house fire that killed an entire family. All ruled accidental by the insurance companies and local authorities, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Those of us who survived started noticing changes in ourselves, difficulty sleeping, recurring nightmares featuring the same symbols we found at the crime scene, and a growing obsession with astronomical phenomena that none of us had shown interest in before. I found myself spending hours staring at star charts, trying to match the patterns in Sarah Lekic's notebook with actual constellations. That is when I discovered what had really happened in Bethel. The symbols weren't random markings or the product of mental illness. They were coordinates, navigation references for something that had visited our planet and left instructions for those chosen to serve as beacons for its return. John Lekic hadn't gone crazy. He had been selected, programmed through dreams and visions to prepare the way for something that existed between the spaces of normal reality. The power plant modifications, the arrangement of victims, the tuning fork device, all of it was designed to create a signal that could be detected across vast distances of space and time. The official report classified the Bethel massacre as an isolated incident of workplace violence, but those of us who worked the case knew better. We had stumbled onto evidence of contact with something that predated human civilization, something that had been watching our species and occasionally selecting individuals to serve as advanced scouts for a larger invasion. Over the years, they tracked similar incidents across Alaska and the Northern Territories. Isolated cases of violence that follow the same pattern. Ordinary people who suddenly become capable of precision killing, crime scenes arranged according to geometric principles, and evidence of technology that shouldn't exist. The authorities always find ways to explain these incidents as mental illness or domestic terrorism, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. The thing that visited John Lekic is still out there, still selecting new agents to prepare for its eventual arrival. The tuning fork device in the Bethel power plant was sealed off by federal authorities and officially forgotten. But satellite imagery shows that the building continues to emit electromagnetic signals that match any known technology. And sometimes, on the clearest winter nights when the aurora is particularly active, you can see lights in the sky above Bethel that move in formations that hurt to look at directly. Lights that respond to the continuous signal coming from that sealed power plant, acknowledging the beacon that John Lekic died to create. I am retired now, living in a small cabin outside Fairbanks, but I still monitor police reports and incident summaries looking for signs of similar cases. The pattern is accelerating, with more frequent incidents reported each year. More ordinary people suddenly becoming precise killers, more crime scenes arranged according to alien geometry, more evidence of technology that our science can explain. The Bethel massacre wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The first successful beacon in a network that spans the entire northern hemisphere. And someday soon, when enough beacons are operational and the signal reaches the right receivers in the darkness between stars, we're going to discover what John Lekic died to summon. Last night, I dreamed about symbols carved into metal ceiling beams. And when I woke up, I found myself holding a pencil and notebook, my hand moving across the page without conscious direction. The symbols I drew matched exactly the ones we found in Bethel 38 years ago, precise and complex and filled with meaning that my human brain isn't equipped to understand. I think I'm being selected now, chosen to carry on John Lekic's work in whatever time I have left. The dreams are getting stronger each night, showing me locations where the next beacons need to be built, people who are ready to receive the programming that will turn them into willing servants of something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. If you live in Alaska or anywhere in the Northern Territories, and you start having dreams about symbols and star patterns, get out. Leave immediately and don't look back. Don't to try to understand what you seeing or research the meanings of the images in your head. Just run. Because once the selection process begins, there is no way to stop it. The official report on the Bethel massacre is sealed in federal archives, but the real story is still being written in the dreams of ordinary people who are slowly being prepared for service. People who will wake up one morning knowing exactly what they need to do, exactly who they need to kill, and exactly how to arrange the pieces for maximum signal strength. The lights in the sky are getting brighter each year, and the pattern is almost complete. Story 3. Ice Fog Pursuit. The Bering Strait encounter. The ghost ship appeared in my sonar display at exactly 2:47 a.m., moving through pack ice that should have crushed any wooden vessel to splinters. And when I raised my binoculars to look, I saw dead men working the rigging. My name is Captain Rick Torres, and they've been running cargo ships through the Bering Strait for 15 years. I thought I knew every hazard these waters could throw at me. Ice flows, sudden storms, equipment failures and temperatures that can kill you in minutes. But nothing in my maritime experience prepared me for what I encountered during that fog-shrouded night in March, when the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond it became as thin as the ice beneath my ship. I was piloting the cargo vessel Northern Star through the strait, carrying supplies to remote villages along the western Alaska coast. The weather had been brutal for 3 days, with visibility near zero and ice fog so thick you couldn't see your own bow lights. My radar was useless in those conditions, picking up false echoes from ice crystals suspended in the air. I was navigating purely by GPS and sonar, hoping my charts were accurate and praying I wouldn't hit anything that could punch through the hull. That was when the Phantom ship showed up on my instruments. The sonar signature made no sense. The contact was huge, at least 200 feet long, but it was moving through ice fields that should have been impassable for anything larger than an icebreaker. Even more puzzling was its speed and maneuverability. The vessel was changing course with impossible precision, threading through narrow channels between ice flows like it had perfect knowledge of every obstacle in its path. I tried raising them on the radio, cycling through every frequency used by commercial and military vessels in the region. Nothing but static and interference that seemed to carry faint sounds of wind and creaking wood. But ships that size don't use wooden construction anymore, not in Arctic waters where the ice can crush steel hulls like aluminum cans. The fog began to lift around 3 a.m., revealing patches of the surrounding ice field under the pale green glow of the aurora. That's when I got my first visual contact with the Phantom ship, and everything I thought I knew about reality started to crumble. She was a 3-masted schooner from another era, her hull painted black and her sails full of wind that wasn't blowing in our world. Ice covered every surface of the vessel, thick enough to add tons of weight to her rigging. Yet she moved through the water with the grace of a ship in perfect trim. Her bow cut through ice floes like they were made of paper, leaving a wake that glowed with phosphorescent light. But it was the crew that made my blood freeze in my veins. Through my binoculars, I could see figures moving on her deck, working the lines and adjusting sails with practiced efficiency. They wore the heavy clothing of 19th century whalers, but their movements were wrong, too fluid and coordinated, like they were being controlled by a single consciousness rather than individual will. And when one of them turned toward my ship, I saw that his face was gone, replaced by a hollow space filled with swirling fog. The Phantom ship began to change course, turning toward the Northern Star with obvious intent. I pushed my engines to maximum power, but the schooner matched my speed effortlessly, maintaining a parallel course that brought her closer with each passing minute. The temperature on my bridge began to drop, even though the heating system was running at full capacity. Frost started forming on the inside of my windows, creating patterns that looked almost like ancient writing. That is when I started receiving the transmissions. They weren't coming through the radio, but directly into my head, like someone was broadcasting memories from another time and place. I saw the phantom ship as she had been in life, the whaling vessel Magdalena out of New Bedford, Massachusetts. I experienced her final voyage through the eyes of her crew, felt their growing desperation as they became trapped in the ice during the winter of 1847. The Magdalena had been hunting bowhead whales in the Bering Sea when an early freeze caught them far from open water. For months, they drifted with the ice pack, their supplies dwindling as the Arctic winter closed around them like a tomb. The crew began to starve, then to freeze, then to do things that no Christian men should ever consider. But starvation and cold weren't the worst things they encountered in that endless winter. Something lived in the deep ice. Something ancient and hungry that had been waiting for prey to deliver itself into the frozen wastes. It spoke to the dying men through the howling wind, promising survival in exchange for service, offering eternal life at a price they were too desperate to refuse. The transmission showed me what happened next, and I wish I could forget what I saw. The crew of the Magdalena didn't just die in the ice. They were transformed, changed into something that could survive in conditions that would kill normal humans, bound to their ship for eternity as payment for their continued existence. They became hunters of the living, luring other vessels into the ice to provide fresh souls for the thing that dwelt in the frozen depths. As these visions flooded my mind, the phantom ship drew alongside the Northern Star. Her crew lined the rails, their eyeless faces turned toward my bridge with expressions of terrible hunger. I could feel them trying to influence my thoughts, whispering suggestions about cutting my engines and letting the ice take my ship, about joining them in their eternal hunt through the Arctic waters. The temperature on my bridge dropped below freezing despite my heating systems running at maximum output. Ice began forming on my control panels, shorting out electrical systems and making it impossible to maintain course. My engine started to sputter as fuel lines froze, and I realized that the phantom ship wasn't just hunting me. She was changing the environment around both vessels, creating the same frozen conditions that had claimed her original crew. Fighting through the mental intrusions, I managed to send out a distress signal before my radio equipment failed completely. But I knew no rescue would come in time. The nearest Coast Guard station was 400 miles away, and by the time they reached my last known position, both ships would have vanished into the ice fog that seemed to follow the Magdalena wherever she sailed. The phantom ship began to glow with that same phosphorescent light I'd seen in her wake, and I realized she was preparing to make the transition between worlds, carrying the Northern Star and her crew into whatever realm she called home. The air around both vessels shimmered like heat waves, but the temperature continued to drop until my breath came out in clouds that froze before they hit the deck. That is when I remembered something from my grandfather, the stories about his own time in these waters during World War II. He told me about encounters with ghost ships and phantom crews, and he passed down a piece of old maritime folklore that most sailors dismissed as superstition. Iron could disrupt the connection between the spirit world and our own, especially iron that had been blessed or consecrated. I had a small steel cross in my cabin, a gift from my wife before this voyage. I grabbed it and pressed it against the ship, the steel hull, while speaking every prayer I could remember from my childhood. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The phantom ship lurched away from the Northern Star like she'd been struck by lightning, her crew screaming soundlessly as their forms began to waver and fade. But they didn't give up easily. The Magdalena circled my ship like a predator, her crew working frantically to maintain the connection between worlds. Ice continued to form on my vessel, weighing down the superstructure and threatening to capsize us if too much accumulated. The phantom crew began throwing ropes across the gap between ships, trying to create physical links that would allow them to board the Northern Star. I grabbed an axe from my emergency equipment and began cutting the ghostly lines as fast as they appeared, each severed rope causing the phantom crew to writhe in apparent agony. But there were too many of them, and they were learning to anticipate my movements, throwing multiple lines simultaneously to overwhelm my ability to cut them all. One of the ropes wrapped around my ankle before I could sever it, and immediately I felt a cold so intense it burned, spreading up my leg like liquid nitrogen in my veins. Through the rope's connection, I experienced flashes of the phantom crew, its existence, endless voyages through ice fields that existed in multiple dimensions, hunting living ships to feed the thing that lived in the deep ice, carrying out an eternal mission of harvesting souls for their inhuman master. I managed to cut the rope with my axe, but the damage was done. Part of the phantom ship's influence had entered my body through that connection, and I could feel it spreading through my nervous system like a virus. My vision began to change, showing me the Northern Star as the Phantom crew saw it, not a modern cargo vessel, but a repository of living energy that could sustain their master for decades. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes in real time. The Phantom ship kept trying to establish connections while I fought to prevent them from boarding my vessel. My steel cross grew hot in my hand, the metal conducting energy between the two realities until it was too painful to hold. But I kept pressing it against different parts of my ship's hull, using it like a talisman to disrupt the supernatural forces trying to claim the Northern Star. Finally, as the aurora began to fade with approaching dawn, the Phantom ship started to retreat. Her crew gathered at the rails one last time, their eyeless faces turned toward me with expressions of rage and frustrated hunger. I could hear their voices in my head, promising that they would return, that the ice fog would hide their approach until I had no chance to escape. The Magdalena faded into the morning mist like she'd never been there at all, leaving only disturbed water and fragments of ice that bore no resemblance to anything natural. My instruments came back online gradually, showing normal readings for temperature and atmospheric conditions. But the steel cross in my cabin had been transformed, its surface now bearing the same strange markings I'd seen in the frost patterns on my windows. I completed my supply run without further incident, but the encounter with the Phantom ship changed something fundamental inside me. The cold that had entered my body through that ghostly rope never fully went away, and sometimes, on the clearest nights when the aurora is particularly active, I can see the Magdalena on the horizon, following my ship through waters where no other vessel travels. She's waiting for me to let down my guard, to forget the protection of iron and prayer that saved me that night. The Phantom crew knows that part of their essence is still inside me, growing stronger with each voyage I make through their hunting grounds. They be patient, these dead whalers, accustomed to waiting decades for the right conditions to claim their prey. They started carrying multiple steel crosses on every voyage, and they had them blessed by ministers of different faiths, hoping that divine protection might be more effective than mere superstition. But I know it is only a matter of time before the Magdalena makes another attempt, and I'm not sure my defenses will hold forever against creatures that have had over a century to perfect their hunting techniques. Other ship captains have reported similar encounters in recent years, always in the same area of the Bering Strait where ice fog provides cover for things that shouldn't exist. The Coast Guard classifies these reports as hallucinations caused by isolation and extreme weather, but those of us who work these waters know better. The Phantom ship is still out there, still hunting, still feeding souls to whatever dwells in the deep ice. And someday, when the fog is thick enough and the conditions are perfect, she'll claim another vessel for her eternal crew. If you ever find yourself sailing through the Bering Strait during the dark months of winter, and you see a three-masted schooner moving through ice that should crush any wooden hull, don't try to help. Don't respond to their signals. Just turn away and pray that your engines are strong enough to outrun the dead. Because once the Phantom crew of the Magdalena sets their sights on your vessel, iron and prayer are the only things that can save you from joining them in their endless voyage through the ice. Story 4. Ice Walker the First should have listened to the warnings. Every local Inukiakvik told me the same thing when I mentioned my research project. Stay inside during blizzards, never mock the ice, never hunt alone. But I was a stubborn climatologist from Phoenix, and I thought their superstitions were just colorful folklore from America, this northernmost city. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I know better. Now I know why the Inupiat people whisper about the polar bear man when the wind howls across the frozen tundra. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Document ice thickness patterns around Barrow for the National Weather Service. Simple measurements, GPS coordinates, standard climate research. My company had sent me to this isolated Alaskan town where the sun disappears for 65 days straight, and I was determined to prove myself. The first red flag came from my guide, Tommy Kanguk. A weathered Inupiat man in his 60s, he had agreed to show me the safe measuring spots along the coast. But on day 3, when I joked about global warming melting all his precious ice, his face went stone cold. "You do not mock Siku," he said, using the Inupiat word for ice. The ice has memory. The ice has ears. I laughed it off. Big mistake. That night, alone in my rented cabin on the outskirts of town, I heard the first sound. A low groaning that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. The permafrost settling, I told myself. Old buildings make noise in extreme cold, but the groaning had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. By morning, Tommy had disappeared. His family said he went hunting and never came back. The local police told me these things happen sometimes in the Arctic. People got lost in whiteouts. Bears attacked. Ice gave way. They suggested I find a new guide or head home early. I chose to work alone. The temperature had dropped to 30 below when I drove my rented truck out to the coastal measurement sites. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a blank canvas of white broken only by distant mountains and the dark line where the Beaufort Sea met the ice shelf. My breath crystallized instantly in the air, and the silence was so complete it felt like being inside a tomb. I was taking core samples near an ice ridge when I found the tracks. They were unlike anything I had ever seen. Larger than human footprints, but shaped wrong for a bear. The front showed distinct toe marks, but the heel was elongated, almost like a paw pad. Most disturbing was how deep they pressed into the packed snow. Whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The tracks led in a straight line toward town, then simply vanished at a patch of bare ice. That night, the groaning under my cabin grew louder. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled into the cramped space beneath the structure. The permafrost was solid, undisturbed, but carved into one of the support beams was a symbol I did not recognize. It looked like a bear claw mark, but too precise, too intentional. I photographed it and uploaded the image to an anthropology forum online. Within hours, I received a private message from a username called Arctic Keeper. You found his mark. Get out of Utqiagvik now, before the next storm. I tried to reply, but the account had already been deleted. The blizzard hit 2 days later. The wind screamed across the tundra at 80 miles per hour, and visibility dropped to 0. I huddled in my cabin, listening to the weather radio announce whiteout conditions and advising all residents to shelter in place until morning. Around midnight, something began walking around my cabin. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, crunching through the snow with mechanical precision. They circled the building 3 times, then stopped directly outside my front door. Through the howling wind, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Sniffing, long, deep inhalations like a massive animal testing the air. I crept to the window and peered through a gap in the frost-covered glass. A shadow moved across the white landscape. Tall, broad shoulders, but the proportions were wrong. The arms hung too long. The head was too large. Then it turned toward my window, and I saw its eyes. They glowed with a pale blue light, like sunlight filtering through thick ice. The face was a horrifying mixture of human and polar bear features. A man, his torso covered in thick white fur, claws instead of fingers, a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. The polar bear man of Utqiagvik. The legend was real. It watched me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it threw back its head and released a sound that was part human scream, part bear roar. The windows rattled. My heart hammered against my ribs. When I looked again, it was gone. I spent the rest of the night barricaded behind my door, clutching a hunting knife I had purchased in town. But the polar bear man did not return. As dawn broke and the storm cleared, I found fresh tracks circling my cabin. Mixed with the strange footprints were drag marks, as if something had been pulled through the snow. Following the trail, I discovered what remained of Tommy Kenga. His body lay twisted in an unnatural position about 50 yards from my cabin. His throat had been torn open by claws. But that was not the worst part. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, but his eyes had been removed and replaced with chunks of ice. Blue ice that glowed faintly in the morning light. I called the police, but the phone lines were down from the storm. I tried my satellite phone, but the battery was dead. My truck would not start in the extreme cold. I was trapped with a monster that killed people who disrespected the ice. And I had been mocking the ice for 3 weeks. That evening, as darkness settled over the Arctic landscape, I heard the groaning again. But this time it was not coming from under my cabin. It was coming from inside the walls. The sound moved through the structure like something alive, flowing from room to room. I followed it with my flashlight, pressing my ear against the drywall. The groaning was accompanied by scratching, as if claws were raking the interior of the building. In the bedroom, I found where the sound originated. A section of the wall had been torn open from the inside, revealing pink insulation and bare studs. Carved into the wood were dozens of the same symbols I had found under the cabin. Bear claw marks arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Between the symbols, written in what looked like frozen blood, was a message in perfect English. The ice remembers every insult. I ran outside into the sub-zero night, preferring to face the polar bear man in open air rather than be trapped in a building it could apparently enter at will. The aurora borealis danced overhead in sheets of green and purple light, but the beauty of the display was lost on me. I was too busy trying to survive. The creature was waiting for me in the middle of the road that led back to town. Up close, the polar bear man was even more terrifying than I had imagined. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its white fur matted with ice and what looked like old blood. Its human torso was muscled like a bodybuilder, but its arms ended in paws with claws the size of railroad spikes. The worst part was its face. It had a human nose and mouth, but the eyes were pure polar bear. Ancient, intelligent, filled with rage. It spoke to me in a voice like breaking ice. You came to measure our home. You laughed at our warnings. You thought you were smarter than the people who have survived here for thousands of years. I tried to run, but my legs would not move. The extreme cold had sapped my strength, and terror had frozen my muscles. The creature approached slowly, savoring my fear. The ice is alive, it continued. It feels every drill bit, every core sample, every joke about global warming. And it remembers those who cause it pain. The polar bear man raised one massive paw, claws extended. I closed my eyes and waited for death, but the killing blow never came. When I opened my eyes, the creature had vanished. In its place stood Tommy Kanguk, very much alive and completely human. He looked exactly as he had the last time I saw him, except for his eyes. They glowed with the same pale blue light I had seen in the monster, his face. The ice gave me a choice, Tommy said in his familiar voice. Serve as its guardian, or die and become nothing. I chose service. He gestured toward the darkness behind him, and I saw them. Dozens of figures standing motionless in the snow, men and women of various ages, all with glowing blue eyes. All watching me with expressions of infinite patience. Every person who has disrespected the ice joins us eventually, Tommy explained. We are the ones who ensure the old ways are remembered, the ones who punish those who mock what they do not understand. I understood then that I had two choices: die here in the frozen wasteland, or accept the transformation and spend eternity as a guardian of the ice. Neither option appealed to me, but only one allowed me to keep existing in some form. I made my choice. The change was more painful than I had expected. My bones stretched and reformed. My muscles expanded. My skin sprouted thick white fur that provided perfect insulation against the Arctic cold. My human consciousness remained intact, but it was joined by something older and wilder. The spirit of the ice itself. Now I patrol the coastline around Utqiagvik, watching for climate researchers and oil company surveyors and anyone else who comes to Alaska thinking they can take what they want without consequences. Most of them listen to the warnings from locals and stay inside during storms. But some of them are like I used to be, stubborn, arrogant, convinced that education and technology make them superior to indigenous wisdom. Those are the ones I visit when the blizzards blow. The ice remembers every insult. And now, so do I. Story 5. Anchorage Mall Stalker. I never believed in evil until I moved to Anchorage in 1987 and took a night security job at Northway Mall. What I discovered in those concrete tunnels beneath the shopping center still wakes me up screaming 37 years later. The mall hired me because 3 security guards had quit in 2 months. No explanation given, just nervous handshakes and hurried departures. The pay was decent for Alaska in the 80s, and I needed work after my discharge from the Army. Simple job, they said. Walk the perimeter, check the doors, watch for break-ins. They never mentioned the parking garage. My first week passed without incident. The mall closed at 9, and I would patrol until sunrise, flashlight cutting through the perpetual Anchorage winter darkness. The building creaked and settled around me like a sleeping giant. Mannequins cast twisted shadows in the storefront windows. Nothing unusual for a place built over permafrost. Then I found the photographs. They were scattered across the floor of the lower parking garage like someone had dropped them while running. Black and white Polaroids, dozens of them, all taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Women walking to their cars. Women fumbling with keys. Women looking over their shoulders with expressions of growing fear. The photos were dated October 1985, March 1986, September 1987. Someone had been watching shoppers for years, documenting their routines, their vulnerability. In every image, The women looked uncomfortable, glancing around as if sensing they were being observed. I gathered the photographs and brought them to my supervisor the next morning. He stared at them for a long moment, then locked them in his desk drawer without a word. When I asked what he planned to do, he told me to forget what I had seen. Some things, he said, were better left alone. But I could not forget those faces, especially because I recognized two of them from missing person flyers posted around town. Sarah Chen, disappeared November 1985. Monica Williams, vanished April 1986. Both women had last been seen leaving Northway Mall after evening shopping trips. The garage became my obsession. During my rounds, I would spend extra time in the lower level, searching for clues the police might have missed. The concrete walls were stained with decades of oil and antifreeze, but in the far corner, near the emergency exit, I noticed something else. Dark spots that could have been blood, leading toward a maintenance door I had never seen open. I tried the handle one night in December. Locked, but as I turned away, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, deliberate, measured footsteps echoing from somewhere deep within the walls. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights in my own rapid breathing. The next night, I brought bolt cutters. The maintenance door opened onto a narrow corridor that ran beneath the entire mall complex. Service tunnels, built in the 70s when the mall was constructed. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. My flashlight beam revealed pipes running along the ceiling and electrical conduits snaking down the walls. But it also revealed something else. Sleeping bags, canned food, a camping stove. Someone had been living down there, hidden beneath the feet of thousands of daily shoppers. And spread across a makeshift table were more photographs. Hundreds of them, a carefully cataloged collection of women, taken over more than 5 years. Each photo was labeled with a date, a time, and a name written in block letters. Some names I recognized from missing person reports. Others belonged to women I had seen around town, going about their normal lives, unaware they were being hunted. At the far end of the tunnel, I found the trophies. Jewelry, purses, car keys, driver's licenses, items that belonged to women who had vanished without explanation. Arranged on shelves like a museum display, each piece tagged with the same methodical handwriting. The collection represented years of careful stalking, planning, and predation. But the worst discovery was the journal. Written in the same block letters, it detailed a systematic campaign of terror. The author described how he would choose his targets, following them for weeks to learn their routines. He wrote about the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of causing fear, the meticulous planning that went into each attack. The entries grew more disturbing as they progressed, describing acts of violence in clinical detail. The final entry was dated 3 days earlier. It mentioned a new target, a blonde woman who worked at the department store upstairs, someone who stayed late for inventory and walked alone to her car in the upper parking level. The entry ended with a simple phrase that made my hands shake. Tonight is the night. I ran through the tunnels, up the emergency stairs, into the main mall corridor. The department store was closed, but I could see light coming from the back office. I pounded on the security gate until a woman appeared, blonde hair tied back, looking annoyed at the interruption. She was alive, but as I tried to explain what I had found, I realized the magnitude of the situation. This was not just about one woman. The photographs, the trophies, the careful documentation suggested something much larger. A predator who had been operating in the shadows of Anchorage for years, using the mall as underground infrastructure as his hunting ground. The police investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the horror. The tunnel system connected not just to Northway Mall, but to the entire downtown shopping district. A network of passages that allowed someone to move unseen throughout the city center, emerging in parking garages, alleyways, and basement entrances. They found evidence linking the stalker to 11 disappearances over 6 years. Women ranging in age from 19 to 45, all taken from shopping areas in downtown Anchorage. The investigation made national news, but the predator himself was never found. The tunnels were searched extensively, but whoever had been living down there had vanished completely, taking his darkest secrets with him. The mall closed the tunnel access points and increased security, but the damage was done. 3 more women disappeared that winter, all from locations connected to the underground network. The pattern suggested the stalker had simply moved his operation deeper underground, beyond the reach of conventional investigation. I quit my security job and left Alaska within a month. But the nightmares followed me. Dreams of concrete tunnels stretching endlessly beneath the earth. Dreams of photographs being taken in the darkness. Dreams of women walking alone, unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows. The case officially went cold in 1990, but I still follow the news from Anchorage. Every few years, another woman disappears from a shopping area downtown. Always the same pattern, always the same lack of evidence. And I wonder if he is still down there, moving through his underground kingdom, collecting photographs and planning his next hunt. The most terrifying part is not what we found in those tunnels. It is what we did not find. No trace of the 11 missing women. No indication of what happened after they were taken. Just empty spaces in the darkness, and the knowledge that somewhere beneath the city, evil had built itself a home. Sometimes I think about that blonde woman from the department store. How close she came to becoming another photograph in that collection. Another name written in block letters. Another life that vanished without explanation into the endless darkness beneath our feet. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he is still watching. Still following. Still taking photographs. The technology has changed, but the hunger remains the same. The need to hunt, to terrorize, to possess what cannot be possessed. The 1980s Anchorage mall stalker was never caught. His crimes were never solved. His victims were never found. But somewhere in the darkness beneath the city, he might still be waiting. Watching. Planning his next move in a game that has no end. That is the truth I carry with me. The knowledge that monsters are real, and they live in the spaces we never think to look. In the tunnels beneath our feet. In the shadows between the lights. In the silence between heartbeats. Evil does not announce itself with fanfare. It whispers in the darkness, patient and persistent, until it finds the perfect moment to strike. And when it does, all that remains are empty spaces and unanswered questions that echo through the years like footsteps in an abandoned tunnel. I moved to Anchorage looking for a fresh start. Instead, I found proof that some hunts never end, and some predators never stop prowling through the darkness, searching for their next victim. Story 6. Ice Tunnel Screams of Whittier. The screams started 300 feet underground, and they have not stopped echoing in my head for 22 years. I came to Whittier, Alaska in March 2002 as part of a government survey team, mapping the abandoned World War II military tunnels beneath the town. What we found down there defied every rational explanation I had built my career on as a structural engineer. Some discoveries are too terrible to report in official documents. Whittier sits on the edge of Prince William Sound like a concrete monument to military paranoia. During the war, the Army Corps of Engineers carved an entire city into the mountain, complete with barracks, mess halls, and miles of connecting tunnels. When the war ended, they sealed most of it up and walked away, leaving a frozen labyrinth buried beneath the permafrost. My team was hired to assess structural integrity before the tunnels were converted into emergency shelters. Standard job: mark the dangerous areas, catalog what remained, and move on to the next project. I had done similar work in abandoned missile silos across the Midwest. Nothing I had not seen before. The first 2 levels went according to plan. Concrete walls cracked from decades of freeze-thaw cycles, but mostly stable. Rusted equipment left behind when the base closed. Empty rooms filled with shadows and the smell of decay. By the 3rd day, we had mapped nearly 2 miles of corridors without incident. Then we reached sub-level C. The elevator down to sub-level C had been welded shut since 1947, according to the military records. We had to cut through 3 inches of steel plating to access the shaft. When the torch finally broke through, a rush of air escaped that was 20 degrees colder than the levels above. The smell that came with it was something I will never forget. Sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in a broken freezer. We rappelled down the elevator shaft with full gear and emergency radios. The darkness at the bottom was absolute, swallowing our headlamps after just a few feet. The concrete walls were covered with a thin layer of ice that reflected our lights in strange, distorted patterns. But it was the silence that bothered me most. No dripping water, no settling sounds, no wind through the ventilation system. Just dead, empty quiet. The first room we entered had been a communication center during the war. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, all frozen solid and covered with ice crystals. But the equipment was not what caught my attention. It was the messages carved into the concrete walls. Day 12. Food running low. Radio still dead. Day 18. Jenkins died in the night. Had to move him to the next room. Day 23. Something moving in the lower tunnels. Not rats, The messages continued for weeks, scratched into the walls with what looked like metal tools. They told the story of a crew that had been trapped down here during the winter of 1947, cut off from the surface when an avalanche blocked the main entrance. But according to military records, Sub-Level C had been evacuated months before any avalanche. We moved deeper into the tunnel system, following our survey maps through a maze of identical concrete corridors. The temperature continued to drop until our breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the still air. Ice covered everything, turning the walls into mirrors that reflected our lights in impossible directions. That was when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere far ahead of us, echoing through the tunnels like the cry of something in terrible pain. A human voice, distorted by distance and desperation. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving us standing in shocked silence. My radio operator tried to contact the surface, but the signal would not penetrate the rock and ice above us. We were alone down here with whatever had made that sound. The logical part of my mind insisted it was just wind through the ventilation system, but wind does not sound like a man calling for help. We pressed forward, following the planned route despite the growing sense that we should turn back. The survey had to be completed, and we were professionals, but with each step deeper into the tunnels, the walls told more of their story. More carved messages, more desperate scratches in the concrete. Day 31. Found the lower levels. Doors are sealed from the inside. Day 35. Tried to break through the ice in the water room. Something underneath. Day 39. Morrison went down to check the generators. Been 3 days. Not coming back. The messages painted a picture of men slowly going insane into darkness, trapped in a frozen tube with no way out. But the final message, carved deeper than the others near what had been the mess hall, was what made my hands shake as I read it. Day 44. They are not dead. They are still down here. Still hungry. We found the first body in a storage room on the lowest level we could access. Perfectly preserved by the cold. Still wearing a 1940s army uniform with sergeant stripes on the sleeve. He was sitting against the wall with his arms wrapped around his knees, head tilted back as if he had died screaming. But his eyes were open, staring at nothing with an expression of absolute terror. There were bite marks on his arms and face. Human bite marks. The second scream came as we were photographing the body for our report. Closer this time, maybe 50 feet away, echoing from a section of tunnel that our maps showed as collapsed. But the sound was clear and unmistakable. A man screaming in pain and fear, his voice cracking with desperation. We followed the sound through a crack in the wall that our survey equipment had missed. It led to a section of tunnels that did not appear on any military blueprints. Rough-hewn passages carved directly into the rock, reinforced with timber supports that had turned black with age. The air here was even colder, so cold that our equipment began malfunctioning. This was where we found the rest of them, bodies scattered throughout the tunnels, all perfectly preserved, all bearing the same bite marks. But they were not lying down like normal corpses. They were positioned as if they had been running when they died, crawling toward exits that did not exist, clawing at walls that would not break, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The third scream came from directly ahead of us, so close we could hear it bouncing off the tunnel walls. But when we reached the source, we found only another body. This one was different from the others, fresher somehow, despite being dressed in the same 1940s uniform. And his mouth was open in a perfect circle, as if he had died in the middle of screaming. That was when I realized the truth. The screams were not coming from somewhere else in the tunnels. They were coming from the bodies themselves. Somehow, impossibly, these men were still screaming after more than 50 years of death. Their voices echoing through the frozen tunnels, trapped forever in their moment of ultimate terror. We ran. Professional procedure be damned. We ran through those tunnels faster than I had ever moved in my life. Behind us, the screaming grew louder and more desperate, as if our presence had awakened something that should have stayed asleep. Multiple voices now, all crying out in anguish and fear, their cries overlapping into a symphony of torment that followed us through the darkness. We made it to the elevator shaft and climbed toward the surface, but the screaming did not stop. Even 3 levels up, we could still hear it echoing from the depths below. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of men dying over and over again in an endless loop of frozen time. The official report listed structural damage and recommended permanent closure of sub-level C. We never mentioned the bodies or the screaming. Who would believe such a thing? But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they are still down there. still screaming in the darkness, trapped forever in that moment of terror when they realized they would never escape. The military sealed the tunnels permanently after our survey, filled the elevator shaft with concrete and posted signs warning people to stay away. But on quiet winter nights in Whittier, people still report hearing faint screaming coming from beneath the ground. The sound of men who died in fear and cold, whose voices refused to be silenced by death. I moved back to the lower 48 after that job and never returned to Alaska. But the screams followed me. In my dreams, I am back in those tunnels, listening to voices that should not exist, seeing faces frozen in eternal terror. And I know that somewhere beneath Whittier, in tunnels that officially do not exist, those men are still dying. Still screaming, still trapped in a hell made of ice and darkness and endless, hopeless fear. The worst part is knowing that we left them there, that they are still down there right now, crying out for help that will never come, their voices echoing through the frozen tunnels until the end of time. Some prisons are built of stone and steel. Others are made of ice and terror and the terrible knowledge that death is not always an escape. What we found beneath Whittier was not just bodies. It was proof that some forms of suffering are too intense to end, even with death. That fear can become so powerful it transcends the physical world and continues forever in the darkness below. And that somewhere beneath our feet, voices are still calling out in the cold, begging for release from a nightmare that has no end. Story 7. Ghosts of the SS Coldbrook. They say the dead dawn to rest easy in Alaska, its waters. I wish I listened to that warning before I took the job. My name is Marcus, and I am a marine salvage specialist. 3 weeks ago, I received a contract that would change everything I thought I knew about death, the ocean, and the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond it. The client wanted me to investigate the SS Coldbrook, a World War II Liberty ship that sank off Kodiak Island in 1943. 80 years later, someone finally had the money and technology to explore what remained of her rusted hull. The pay was triple my usual rate. That should have been my first red flag. I arrived in Kodiak on a gray October morning, the kind where the sky and sea blend into one suffocating blanket of steel. The town felt smaller than it looked on maps, full of weathered fishermen who went quiet whenever I mentioned the Coldbrook. Their eyes would drift to the horizon, then back to their drinks, as if speaking her name might summon something they'd rather leave sleeping. My contact was a thin man named Garrett who worked for some East Coast shipping company. He met me at the harbor wearing an expensive suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of fishing boats and seagulls. His handshake was clammy, his smile never reached his eyes, and he kept checking his watch like he was late for his own funeral. The Coldbrook had been carrying supplies to the Aleutian Islands when she went down during a November storm. Official records said she hit a reef in heavy fog, but the locals told different stories. Some claimed they heard distress calls on clear nights decades after the sinking. Others swore they'd seen lights moving beneath the water where no lights should be. Garrett handed me a thick folder of documents, most of them so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art. What I could read painted a picture of a routine cargo run that ended in tragedy. 37 souls lost to the Bering Sea. The ship had been located by sonar 2 years ago, sitting upright in 200 feet of water, her hull split open like a gutted fish. My job was simple: dive down, document the wreck, and retrieve anything of historical significance. The company would provide all equipment and support. Easy money, or so I thought. The dive boat was a converted fishing vessel called the Northern Star, captained by a grizzled local named Tommy Akiak. Tommy was a Luteek, born and raised on Kodiak, and he knew these waters better than anyone. But when I mentioned our destination, his weathered face went pale. "You sure you want to go out there?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "That's bad water, brother. My grandfather used to say some places are meant to stay hidden." I laughed it off. After 15 years of deep-sea salvage, I heard every superstition imaginable. Cursed ships, angry spirits, underwater monsters. Fishermen loved their ghost stories. But Tommy, his expression remained deadly serious. "I'm not talking about fairy tales," he said. 3 boats have gone missing near that wreck in the past decade. Coast Guard never found so much as a life preserver. The journey to the dive site took 4 hours through increasingly rough seas. As we moved farther from shore, the water changed from green to an unsettling black that seemed to swallow light itself. The GPS coordinates led us to a patch of ocean that looked identical to every other patch, but something about this place felt wrong. The air was too still. The birds that had followed us from harbor suddenly turned back, as if hitting an invisible wall. When we dropped anchor, the silence was deafening. No wind, no waves lapping against the hull, just an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. Even the engine seemed muffled, like we entered some acoustic dead zone. I suited up in my cold water gear, checking and double-checking every seal and connection. The water temperature hovered around 40 degrees, cold enough to kill in minutes without proper protection. My diving helmet was equipped with a high-definition camera and two-way radio, allowing Garrett and Tommy to monitor everything from the surface. The descent began normally. 20 feet down, the surface light faded to a dim blue-green glow. 40 feet, and visibility dropped to maybe 10 yards through the murky water. At 60 feet, something changed. The water itself seemed heavier, more resistant, like diving through liquid mercury instead of seawater. At 100 feet, my lights picked up the first debris field. Scattered chunks of twisted metal and rotting wood littered the seafloor, leading toward a massive shadow that loomed in the darkness ahead. My heart rate spiked as the full outline of the SS Coldbrook emerged from the gloom. She was enormous, nearly 500 feet of rusted steel sitting upright on the bottom like she had been gently placed there by giant hands. But something was wrong with the way she looked. Ships don't usually remain this intact after 8 decades underwater. Most wrecks collapse under their own weight, become unrecognizable heaps of scrap metal. The Coldbrook looked almost pristine, as if she sunk yesterday. I swam closer, my lights illuminating patches of her hull. The metal was covered in a thick layer of marine growth, but underneath, I could still make out her original gray paint. Portholes stared back at me like dead eyes, their glass somehow still unbroken despite the crushing depth and decades of corrosion. Beautiful. ISN, Tishi? Garrett, his voice crackled through my helmet radio, making me jump. The cold water preserved her better than we hoped. I began my documentation, swimming along the starboard side and filming everything. The ship, this superstructure, rose above me like an underwater skyscraper, her masts and rigging creating a twisted forest of cables and rust. Schools of pale fish darted between the wreckage, their movements oddly synchronized, like they were fleeing something I couldn't see. Near the stern, I found the first bodies. They were trapped in what remained of a collapsed lifeboat, their bones picked clean by decades of scavengers but still held together by scraps of clothing and equipment. 7 skeletons huddled together, frozen in their final moments. But these weren't the sun-bleached bones you'd expect to find. They were black, as if they'd been burned from the inside. Control, are you seeing this? I whispered into my radio. Static answered me. I tried again. Nothing but electronic snow filled my helmet. My depth gauge showed 190 feet, well within radio range. The equipment had been working perfectly just minutes before. A movement in my peripheral vision made me spin around. One of the skeletons had shifted position, its skull turning to face me. I blinked hard, certain it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, empty sockets stared directly into my camera. I backed away from the lifeboat, my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Panic is a diver's worst enemy. I forced myself to slow down, to think rationally. Currents could move objects underwater. The skeleton had simply been disturbed by my presence. But skeletons don't move their heads independently of their bodies. I continued documenting the wreck, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was watching me. Every shadow seemed to contain movement. Every piece of debris looked like it might suddenly come alive. The fish had disappeared entirely, leaving me alone in the crushing darkness with only the sound of my own breathing for company. The main cargo hold was my next target. According to the manifest, the Coldbrook had been carrying medical supplies, ammunition, and food rations to support American forces in the Aleutians. But when I shined my lights through the massive tear in her hull, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Crates, dozens of wooden crates stacked neatly in the hold, their surfaces covered in symbols I didn't recognize. They looked military but wrong somehow, like they had been designed by people who had never seen actual military equipment. Each crate was marked with the same recurring symbol, a circle containing what looked like an eye surrounded by radiating lines. I swam inside for a closer look, my lights creating dancing shadows on the hold's walls. The crates were secured with heavy chains, as if someone had been worried about their contents escaping rather than shifting during rough seas. One container near the entrance had split open, revealing dozens of smaller boxes wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside those boxes were photographs, hundreds of black and white photographs showing faces I'd never seen but somehow recognized. Men and women with hollow eyes and expressions of absolute terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Some appeared to be soldiers, others civilians, but all shared that same look of having seen something that broke their minds. At the bottom of each photo was a handwritten date and location. Some were from European battlefields I'd heard of, others from Pacific islands that didn't exist on any map. The dates ranged from 1940 to 1943, but the most disturbing detail was that every single photograph was taken after the official death date of its subject. I grabbed a handful of photos for evidence and continued deeper into the hole. The strange crates seemed to go on forever, stacked higher than my lights could reach. But it was the sound that finally made me turn back. A low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It sounded like a heartbeat. The thumping grew louder as I made my way back toward the hull breach, echoing through the water with increasing urgency. My equipment showed no mechanical malfunctions, no reason for the noise, but it was definitely there. Other sounds joined it, distant voices speaking in languages I couldn't identify, the groan of metal under stress, and something that might have been sobbing. I reached the opening and prepared to exit the cargo hold when something grabbed my ankle. The grip was impossibly strong, cold fingers wrapping around my leg through the thick neoprene of my diving suit. I looked down to see a skeletal hand extending from beneath a fallen beam, its bones gleaming white in my helmet lights. The rest of the body was pinned under tons of twisted metal, but somehow that hand was moving with purposeful intent. I kicked frantically, trying to break free, but more hands emerged from the wreckage around me. They reached through gaps in the debris, grasping at my equipment and airlines with desperate hunger. The water filled with a chorus of voices, dozens of men shouting warnings in overlapping languages, their words blending into an incomprehensible wall of sound. My depth gauge began spinning wildly, showing impossible readings that changed by the second. 200 feet, 500, 1,000. The numbers climbed higher as if I was falling through the ocean floor itself, but I could still see the cargo hold walls around me. My air supply gauge flickered between full and empty, unable to settle on a consistent reading. The skeletal hands multiplied, pulling me deeper into the hold despite my struggles. I could see faces in the darkness now, transparent figures standing among the crates with their mouths moving in silent conversation. They wore the uniforms of different nations: American sailors, German soldiers, British airmen, Soviet infantry, all mixed together in death as they'd never been in life. One figure approached me directly, a young man in a U.S. Navy uniform. His face was pale and waterlogged, his eyes reflecting my helmet lights like a cat's. When he spoke, I heard his voice inside my head rather than through my ears. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "This isn't a place for the living." I tried to respond, to ask what had happened to his ship, but no words came out. The ghostly sailor gestured toward the strange crates surrounding us. "They were transporting more than supplies," he continued. "Things they found in the European theaters. Artifacts from bombed churches and ancient sites. Objects that should have remained buried. We were ordered to bring them to a research facility in Alaska, but something went wrong during the crossing." The crates began to glow with a sickly green light that seemed to pulse in time with that rhythmic heartbeat. The symbols carved into their surfaces writhed and shifted like living things, rearranging themselves into new configurations that hurt to look at directly. "The storm didn't sink us," the sailor said. "We sank ourselves rather than let those things reach land. But it was too late. They'd already begun to change us, to make us into something else. Now we guard them, keep them from rising to the surface." The skeletal hands released their grip on me, but I found I couldn't move anyway. The water around me had become thick as molasses, trapping me in place while the ghostly figures continued their eternal vigil. More spirits materialized from the shadows, the entire crew of the Coldbrook, along with others I didn't recognize. Men and women from different eras, all drawn to this underwater tomb by the same malevolent force. "Every few years, someone comes looking for us," another voice said. This one belonged to a woman in a diving suit similar to mine. Her helmet cracked open to reveal a face consumed by some kind of luminescent algae. "Treasure hunters, historians, government agents. They all think they know what they re-dealing with. They all wrong. I understood then that I wasn't the first salvage diver to reach the Coldbrook. The missing boats Tommy had mentioned, the researchers who never returned, they were all here, added to the ship, this ghostly crew, and now I was about to join them. But the dead sailor held up his hand, stopping the others from advancing. This one is different, he said, studying me with those glowing eyes. He is not here for greed or glory. He's just doing his job. The spirit looked toward the hull breach, then back at me. I'll give you one chance. Leave now, forget this scene, and never speak of this place. If you try to return or send others, I'll share our fate. The thick water suddenly released its hold on me, and I found myself propelled upward by my own buoyancy. The ghostly figures faded back into shadows as I rocketed toward the hull opening, my equipment readings returning to normal. But just before I escaped the cargo hold, I heard one final message from the depths. Tell them the Coldbrook is gone. Tell them there's nothing left to find. The ascent to the surface felt like emerging from a nightmare. Colors returned gradually, the oppressive darkness giving way to filtered sunlight. When I finally broke through, gasping and shaking in the October air, Tommy and Garrett were waiting with expressions of deep concern. You were down there for over 3 hours, Tommy said, helping me onto the boat. We lost radio contact after the first 10 minutes. What happened? I looked back at the water, now calm and ordinary under the afternoon sun. No sign of the supernatural forces that had nearly claimed me. Part of me wondered if it had all been nitrogen narcosis, a hallucination brought on by too much depth and pressure. But the photographs in my equipment pouch told a different story. Except when I checked, the pouch was empty. Garrett peppered me with questions during the boat ride back to harbor, but I stuck to the story the ghost sailor had suggested. Equipment malfunction, poor visibility, nothing of value found. The wreck was too damaged and dangerous for further exploration. He didn't believe me, of course. The suspicious glances and whispered phone calls made that clear. But without evidence or a credible witness, there was little he could do. I submitted my report, collected my payment, and booked the first flight back to Seattle. That was 3 weeks ago. I thought putting distance between myself and the Coldbrook would end the nightmare. But I was wrong. Every night since returning home, I've dreamed of that underwater tomb. I see the ghostly crew standing guard over their cursed cargo, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble into their realm. Worse, I started seeing them during the day. Translucent figures standing in grocery store aisles, sitting in empty restaurant booths, walking past my apartment windows. They never speak, never threaten. Just watch me with those glowing eyes as if to remind me of the promise I made. Yesterday, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, showing a man in diving gear surrounded by skeletal hands. The face behind the helmet visor was mine, and the expression was one of absolute terror. At the bottom, in familiar handwriting, was yesterday, his date, and the coordinates of the SS Coldbrook. I tried to convince myself it was an elaborate hoax, but the evidence keeps mounting. My diving equipment, which I carefully cleaned and stored, now smells like seawater and decay. The wetsuit I wore to the wreck has developed patches of the same luminescent algae I saw on the ghostly diver. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that rhythmic thumping sound echoing through my apartment walls. The dead dawn, rest easy in Alaska, its waters, and now I understand why. Some secrets are too dangerous to disturb, some treasures too cursed to claim. The SS Coldbrook and her spectral crew serve as guardians against forces that should never see daylight again. I'm telling you this story as a warning. If anyone ever offers you a job involving the Coldbrook, turn it down. No amount of money is worth joining that underwater legion of the damned. And if you ever diving in Alaska waters and see lights where no lights should be, swim away as fast as you can. Because once they've seen the ghosts of the Coldbrook, they will never stop watching you. And eventually, they'll come to collect what they believe is rightfully theirs. Trust me on this. I can hear them calling my name right now. Story 8 to 1964 Good Friday Earthquake. The tsunami of souls. I never believed in ghosts until I saw an entire town die twice. My name is Robert, and I am a seismologist for the United States Geological Survey. What I am about to tell you happened during my investigation of the 1964 Good Friday earthquake in Alaska. The most powerful earthquake in North American history killed 131 people and changed the landscape forever. But the official records don't to tell the whole story. They don't to mention what rose from the ruins of old Valdez, or why some disasters echo through time like broken records that never stop playing. Last March, I was sent to investigate unusual seismic readings near Prince William Sound. 59 years after the original quake, sensitive instruments were detecting micro-tremors that followed the exact same pattern as the 1964 disaster. The readings made no geological sense. Earthquakes don't repeat their signatures decades later like some kind of natural déjà vu. I flew into Anchorage on a cold Tuesday morning, rented a truck, and drove the 300 miles to Valdez through landscape that still bore scars from that terrible Good Friday. The Richardson Highway wound through mountains where entire sections of rock face had sheared away during the quake, leaving raw granite wounds that would never fully heal. The new town of Valdez sits 4 miles from where the original community stood. After the earthquake and tsunami destroyed everything, they simply started over in a safer location. But the old town site remains, marked only by a few historical placards and the ghostly outlines of foundations buried under decades of vegetation growth. My contact was Dr. Sarah Chen, a geologist who had been monitoring the anomalous readings for 6 months. She met me at the small local airport, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like fear. Sarah had worked earthquake zones around the world, from California to Japan. But something about this assignment was different. The drive to our temporary research station took us past the old Valdez site. Sarah slowed the truck and pointed toward a flat area near the water where tangled metal and broken concrete poked through the snow like bones through skin. "That's where the Valdez dock used to be," she said. 31 people died when the tsunami hit. The wave was over 100 feet tall and moving at 600 miles per hour. Nothing could survive that kind of force. I stared at the desolate landscape, trying to imagine a thriving port community where now only silence remained. The water of Prince William Sound lapped peacefully at the shore, giving no hint of the destruction it had once carried. Our research station was a collection of prefabricated buildings set up near the original earthquake epicenter. Banks of seismic equipment monitored every vibration in the earth, from major fault movements down to footsteps on frozen ground. The data they collected over the past months defied explanation. Every year on March 27th, at exactly 5:36 p.m. Alaska Standard Time, the instruments recorded the same sequence of tremors that had preceded the original earthquake. But instead of building to a catastrophic release, the readings would fade after exactly 4 minutes and 28 seconds. The same duration as the main shock that had devastated Alaska in 1964. "It's like the Earth is remembering," Sarah explained as she showed me the data. "But that is impossible. Rock doesn't have memory. Tectonic plates don't experience trauma." I spent the first week running every test I could think of. Instrumental malfunction, magnetic interference, human error. I checked everything twice. But the equipment was functioning perfectly, and the readings were consistent across multiple monitoring stations. Something was causing the ground to vibrate in patterns that matched an event from nearly 60 years ago. The breakthrough came during my second week, when I decided to visit the old town site during one of the Phantom Quake episodes. I wanted to place a portable seismometer directly on the ruins to get more precise readings. March 27th fell on a Tuesday that year, overcast and bitter cold. I set up my equipment on what had once been Main Street, now just a depression in the earth marked by scattered debris. At 5:36 p.m., I watched the seismometer display and waited. The tremors started right on schedule, gentle at first but building in intensity. But something else began to happen that no instrument could measure. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and my breath began forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The sound came next, a low rumble that seemed to rise from deep underground, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. Then I saw the lights. Pale blue flames flickered among the ruins, dancing over foundations and twisted metal with no apparent source. They moved with purpose, following paths that might have once been streets or sidewalks. As the phantom earthquake reached its peak intensity, the lights grew brighter and began to take shape. They were people, translucent figures walking through the ruins as if the town still existed around them. Men in heavy coats heading toward the non-existent docks. Women carrying children who would never age. Families gathered around dinner tables that had been swept away by the tsunami decades ago. I watched in frozen terror as an entire community went through the motions of their final day, unaware that their world had already ended. They moved with the casual routine of people who had no idea they were living their last hours. A man checked his watch and hurried toward the waterfront. A woman hung laundry that would never dry. The seismometer registered the exact moment when the original earthquake had reached maximum intensity. The ghostly figures suddenly looked up from their activities, confusion replacing routine on their translucent faces. They began pointing toward the harbor, their mouths opening in silent screams as they saw something approaching from the water. The tsunami came next, but this one was made of memory and grief instead of water. A massive wall of darkness swept across the ruins, carrying the spectral figures away like leaves in a hurricane. Their forms stretched and distorted as the phantom wave engulfed them, faces contorting in expressions of terror and disbelief. When it was over, the ruins stood empty again. The temperature returned to normal, the blue flames vanished, and my seismometer showed nothing but background vibration. But I knew I witnessed something that challenged everything I thought I understood about death, time, and the physical world. I stumbled back to the research station in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. Sarah was waiting with concerned eyes and a steaming cup of coffee that I accepted with shaking hands. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, then paused as she realized what she just said. I told her everything. The lights, the figures, the phantom tsunami that replayed the town, this destruction with supernatural precision. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "I've been seeing things too," she admitted when I finished. Shadows moving through the equipment shed, voices carried on the wind. I thought it was just isolation and stress, but maybe we were both experiencing the same phenomenon. We decided to return to the ruins together the next evening, bringing additional recording equipment to document whatever was happening. If we were both losing our minds, at least we did have company. But if something genuinely paranormal was occurring, we needed proof. The second visit was even more intense than the first. The ghostly reenactment began the same way, with flickering lights and translucent figures going about their daily routines. But this time, some of them seemed aware of our presence. A young girl in a school dress stopped playing hopscotch and stared directly at us. Her mouth moved as if she was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. An elderly man sitting on his porch put down his newspaper and waved in our direction. His face creased in a sad smile. Most disturbing was a woman who approached us directly, walking through the ruins with determined steps. She wore a nurse's uniform from the 1960s, and her face bore an expression of desperate urgency. She gestured toward the harbor, then pointed at us, then back toward the water. Her meaning was clear. She was trying to warn us about something. The phantom earthquake reached its crescendo, and once again the ghostly tsunami swept through the ruins. But this time, as the wave of darkness approached our position, I felt a physical force pushing against my body. The spectral water was somehow interacting with the real world, carrying a chill that penetrated to my bones. Sarah grabbed my arm as we watched the phantom wave crash over us. For a moment, we were submerged in memories of terror and death, experiencing the final moments of everyone who died in the original disaster. The sensation of drowning filled my lungs even though I was breathing normally. The taste of salt water flooded my mouth even though my lips were dry. When the vision ended, we found ourselves lying on the frozen ground 20 feet from where we started. Our equipment was scattered across the ruins, some pieces damaged as if they'd been struck by real debris. The implications were terrifying. The phantom tsunami wasn't just a visual phenomenon. It carried some form of physical force that could affect the present world. Over the following weeks, we documented dozens of similar episodes. The ghostly replay occurred not just on the anniversary date, but randomly throughout the month. Sometimes we catch glimpses of the spectral town during daylight hours, superimposed over the actual ruins like a double-exposed photograph. But the phenomena were growing stronger. Equipment began malfunctioning without explanation. Our generator would shut down at random intervals, plunging the research station into darkness. Strange sounds echoed through the buildings at night, footsteps on the roof, knocking on doors that led to empty rooms, voices calling names of people who died decades ago. The breaking point came during my third week in Valdez. I was alone at the research station while Sarah drove to Anchorage for supplies. A winter storm had moved in, cutting power lines and blocking the roads with heavy snow. I was effectively trapped with only emergency power and dwindling food supplies. Around midnight, the phantom earthquake began without warning. This had never happened before. The tremors always occurred during evening hours, never in the middle of the night. I rushed to check the seismometers and found readings that were off the charts, far more intense than any previous episode. The spectral town materialized around the research station itself, as if the boundaries between past and present had completely dissolved. Ghostly buildings rose from the snow, their walls passing through our prefabricated structures like they occupied the same space but different dimensions. I found myself standing in what appeared to be a 1960s grocery store, complete with vintage products on the shelves and a cash register that rang up sales for customers who had been dead for 60 years. But something was different about this manifestation. The ghostly figures were no longer oblivious to their fate. They moved with frantic urgency, gathering possessions and loved ones as if they knew what was coming. The young girl I'd seen before ran up to me, her translucent form flickering like a television with poor reception. This time, I could hear her voice, thin and distant like an echo from the bottom of a well. "The wave is coming early," she whispered. "It's angry because people keep disturbing the memories. You have to leave before it takes you to." Before I could respond, she faded away like smoke in the wind. But her warning proved accurate. The phantom tsunami was building faster and larger than I'd ever seen. A wall of supernatural darkness that towered above the ghostly buildings and reached toward the stars. I ran for the research station's main building, but the phantom town, the streets kept shifting around me. Roads that had led to safety suddenly ended in collapsed foundations. Familiar landmarks vanished and reappeared in wrong locations, as if the geography of memory was unstable and constantly changing. The ghostly wave struck while I was still searching for shelter. This time, there was no gentle chill or brief sensation of drowning. The phantom tsunami hit with the full force of the original disaster, slamming me to the ground and dragging me across the ruins with irresistible power. I tumbled through a landscape of memory and death, surrounded by the screams of people who had been swept away in 1964. Their faces flashed past me in the supernatural flood. Men, women, children, all wearing expressions of shock and terror as they realized their world was ending. But among the victims' faces, I began to recognize others. Recent faces, people who had visited the ruins over the decades since the disaster. Tourists, researchers, curiosity seekers who had come looking for answers or thrills. All of them now part of the phantom tsunami, their own deaths adding to the spectral catastrophe. The ghostly wave finally released its grip, depositing me back in the real world outside the research station. I was soaked to the skin despite the fact that no actual water had touched me. My clothes were torn, and my body ached as if I had been physically battered by debris. But I was alive, and that meant I still had a chance to escape. I gathered only essential supplies and abandoned the research station within hours. The drive back to Anchorage through the storm-blocked roads was harrowing, but nothing compared to what I experienced in those ruins. Behind me, the old Valdez site disappeared into the darkness, but I could see strange lights flickering in my rearview mirror long after the town should have been out of sight. Sarah found my abandoned equipment 3 days later when the roads finally cleared. My final seismic readings showed activity that was impossible according to every law of physics, underground movements that suggested the Earth itself was screaming. I submitted my report to USGS headquarters, carefully edited to remove any mention of supernatural phenomena. Official records now show that the anomalous seismic readings were caused by previously unknown aftershocks from the 1964 earthquake. Case closed. Nothing to see here. Move along. But I know the truth. The 1964 Good Friday earthquake didn't just kill 131 people and destroy several towns. It created a wound in reality itself, a place where the boundary between past and present remains forever broken. The phantom tsunami still rises in the ruins of old Valdez, carrying away anyone foolish enough to witness its terrible replay. And each time it strikes, it grows stronger, fed by new victims who thought they were just studying a historical disaster. I tried to warn other researchers, but who would believe such a story? Seismologists deal in facts and measurements, not ghost stories and supernatural phenomena. So the investigations continue, and the ruins keep claiming new victims. If you ever find yourself near the old Valdez site, especially around the anniversary of the earthquake, I have one piece of advice. Turn around and leave. Don't let curiosity override survival instinct. Some disasters are too powerful to remain safely buried in the past. The dead of Valdez are still trying to escape their fate, and they It'll drag anyone they can find down with them into that eternal tsunami of souls. Trust me on this, I barely made it out alive, and I can still hear their voices calling my name in the wind. Story 9. Tundra Inupiat vampire. Something followed me home from the North Slope, and it is still hungry. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a roughneck who spent 3 years working the oil fields above the Arctic Circle. What I'm about to tell you happened during my final winter in Alaska, when the sun disappeared for 65 days straight and something ancient began hunting the living in that endless darkness. Most people don't understand what the polar night does to your mind. Imagine 2 months without sunlight, where noon looks exactly like midnight, where your body forgets what day means. The Inupiat people they lived up there for thousands of years have dozens of words for different types of darkness. They understand that some shadows are deeper than others, and some hungers never die. I was stationed at a remote drilling site called Dead Horse Station, about as far north as you can go in Alaska without falling off the edge of the world. 37 men working 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could freeze your breath before it left your lungs. The nearest town was Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, and even that was 100 miles of frozen wasteland away. The isolation was bad enough, but it was the darkness that really got to you. Not just the absence of light, but the weight of it pressing down like a living thing. By the third week of polar night, half the crew was popping prescription sleep aids just to tell their bodies when to rest. The other half had given up on sleep entirely and wandered the facility like ghosts, working double shifts because there was nothing else to do. I was somewhere in between, catching naps when exhaustion finally won out over the constant electric lighting that tried to fool our brains into thinking day still existed. That is when the dreams started. Nightmares about being chased across the tundra by something that looked almost human but moved all wrong, like a puppet controlled by someone who'd never seen a person walk. The first incident happened during week 4 of the darkness. Tommy Okafor, one of the newer guys from Texas, disappeared from his bunk during what should have been night shift. We found his sleeping bag torn open from the inside, the fabric shredded as if he'd grown claws and fought his way out. His boots were still by the bed, but his winter gear was gone. The search lasted 3 days, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging combing every square mile within walking distance. The tundra in winter is no place for a man alone, especially without proper preparation. Temperatures at 40 below with wind that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. We all knew Tommy was dead, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. They found his body 7 miles from the station, frozen solid in a snowbank. But something about the scene didn't add up. His winter gear was intact, no signs of exposure or frostbite. The autopsy report mentioned severe blood loss, but no obvious wounds. The company lawyers sealed the file and shipped the body home to his family with a substantial settlement and strict confidentiality agreements. 2 weeks later, it was Marcus Chen, this turn. Marcus had been working the North Slope for 8 years, knew the dangers better than anyone. But his bunk was found empty just like Tommy, his torn sleeping bag and missing winter gear. This time the search was called off after 1 day. The brass claimed it was too dangerous to risk more lives on what they called a clear case of polar madness. I knew better. Both men had been acting strange in the days before they vanished. Complaining about vivid dreams, insisting they could hear voices calling their names from outside the facility. During meals, they stare at the frosted windows with expressions of longing, as if something out there was promising them relief from the suffocating darkness. The third disappearance broke the pattern. Sarah Kim was our radio operator, a tough woman from Anchorage who worked remote sites across Alaska for 15 years. She vanished during what should have been broad daylight, though of course it was just as dark as every other hour of polar night. But this time, we found evidence of a struggle. Her radio equipment was smashed, the metal twisted into impossible shapes as if massive hands had crushed it like paper. Deep gouges in the concrete floor suggested something with incredible strength had dragged her toward the exit. But the most disturbing detail was the blood trail that led outside and then simply stopped, as if she'd been lifted into the air by something that could fly. The company wanted to evacuate the entire facility, but winter storms had grounded all aircraft for the next 10 days. We were trapped in that metal box with whatever was picking us off one by one, and the darkness outside was getting hungrier. That is when Joseph Anakausrik arrived. Joseph was Inupiat, born and raised in Utqiagvik, and he'd been hired as an emergency cultural liaison after the disappearances started making news. The oil company was worried about bad publicity. especially with the native communities who had been fighting the drilling operations for years. But Joseph didn't. He'd come to smooth things over with corporate speak and damage control. He came to hunt a monster. I was on duty in the equipment bay when Joseph found me, his weathered face grim with knowledge I didn't want to understand. He was maybe 60 years old, but moved with the fluid grace of someone half his age, his dark eyes constantly scanning the shadows as if expecting an attack. Joseph examined the damage to Sarah's radio station with the intensity of a detective studying a crime scene. He ran his fingers along the twisted metal and gouged concrete, nodding as if the destruction was telling him a story. When he finished his inspection, his expression had darkened even further. The thing hunting us wasn't human, he explained. It was something the Inupiat called ajupinik, which roughly translated to the hunger that walks. European settlers would have called it a vampire, but that word carried too much Hollywood baggage to describe what we were really dealing with. The ajupinik had once been human, probably centuries ago, but starvation during a brutal winter had driven it to cannibalism. Instead of dying, the act of consuming human flesh had transformed it into something else, something that could survive the polar night indefinitely by feeding on the life force of others. It was a shapeshifter, able to appear human when necessary, but its true form was a twisted mockery of a person that moved too fast and hit too hard to be natural. Most disturbing was its hunting method. The creature didn't just kill its victims. It slowly drained their will to live over several days, filling their dreams with visions of escape and warmth until they voluntarily walked out into the killing cold. By the time it actually fed, its prey was already half dead from psychological torture. The missing workers hadn't been kidnapped. They'd been seduced into becoming willing victims. Joseph, his plan was simple but terrifying. The ajupinik was drawn to isolated targets, people who were alone and vulnerable. We would use that instinct against it by setting a trap, with me as bait. I volunteered because I already started having the dreams, which meant the creature had marked me as its next victim anyway. The trap required me to work alone in the farthest section of the facility, a maintenance area that was poorly lit and far from help. Joseph would hide nearby with a hunting rifle loaded with rounds he blessed according to traditional Inupiat rituals. When the creature came for me, he'd have one chance to put it down permanently. I spent 3 hours in that maintenance bay, pretending to work while my skin crawled with the certainty that something was watching me. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every sound of settling metal made me jump and reach for the flashlight I'd been told to keep handy. The attack came without warning. One moment I was alone, checking pipe connections with nervous energy. The next, something was standing behind me, breathing cold air down my neck with lungs that sounded damaged and wrong. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to crack bone. The thing that had once been human stood 8 feet tall, its limbs stretched and elongated like taffy. Its skin was pale white with a blue undertone, the color of flesh that had frozen and thawed too many times. But it was the eyes that made my bladder nearly release, black pits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, hungry voids that promised nothing but pain. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth, far too many to fit in any human jaw. When it spoke, the voice was a chorus of different people, the stolen vocal cords of everyone it had consumed over the centuries. The ajupinik didn't attack immediately. Instead, it began circling me like a predator toying with wounded prey, its movements flowing and unnatural. It spoke in the voices of Tommy, Marcus, and Sarah, using their memories to torment me with promises of escape from the endless darkness. It told me about the warmth waiting outside, about the aurora borealis that was supposedly dancing across the sky just beyond the facility walls. All I had to do was follow it into the night, and the cold would feel like a warm bath, the wind like a gentle caress. Death would be a relief from the suffocating metal tomb where we'd been trapped for months. For a moment, I almost believed it. The creature, its words painted such vivid pictures of freedom that I took a step toward the exit door. But then Joseph's rifle cracked like thunder in the enclosed space, and the ajupinik screamed with a sound that shattered every piece of glass in the maintenance bay. The blessed ammunition tore through the creature, its elongated torso, spraying black blood that hissed and steamed when it hit the concrete floor. But instead of falling, the ajupinik began to change, its form shifting and flowing like liquid shadow. For a moment it looked like Sarah Kim, then Tommy Okafor, then something that might have been its original human form from centuries past. Joseph fired again, this time aiming for the creature's head. The impact snapped its neck backward at an impossible angle, but it kept moving, kept changing. Its limbs began stretching even longer, reaching toward me with fingers that ended in claws like icicles. The third shot finally dropped it, the blessed bullet finding something vital in the creature's shifting anatomy. The Ajupini collapsed in a heap of steaming flesh that slowly dissolved into black liquid, then into nothing at all. When the smoke cleared, only a dark stain on the concrete remained to prove it had ever existed. Joseph stood over the stain with his rifle still raised, watching for any sign that the creature might reconstitute itself. But the maintenance bay had fallen silent except for the hum of machinery and the sound of our own ragged breathing. The nightmare should have ended there, but it didn't. Over the following days, more workers reported dreams about voices calling from outside the facility. The thermal imaging cameras began picking up human-shaped figures moving across the tundra, always just at the edge of detection range. And I started noticing that my reflection in mirrors looked slightly wrong, as if something else was wearing my face. Joseph explained that killing an Ajupini didn't destroy it completely. It just forced the creature to find a new host. The hunger that walks was looking for a way back into our world, and it had apparently decided I was the most suitable candidate. The evacuation helicopters finally arrived during a brief break in the weather, airlifting the entire crew back to civilization in record time. The oil company officially blamed the incidents on carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heating systems, a cover story that satisfied insurance investigators and kept the media from asking uncomfortable questions. But I brought something back with me from the North Slope, something that whispers in my dreams and fills my waking hours with visions of Arctic wasteland. Every mirror shows me a face that is almost mine but not quite, with eyes that reflect light in ways human eyes shouldn't. The hunger is growing stronger each day, and I understand now why the missing workers walked willingly into the killing cold. The Ajupini doesn't just hunt its victims, it transforms them into versions of itself, spreading the curse like a supernatural virus through isolated communities. I've been fighting it for 6 months now, moving constantly to avoid putting anyone else at risk. But the thing inside me is getting impatient, and I can feel my resistance weakening. Soon I'll be nothing more than another puppet for an ancient hunger that feeds on human life. If you ever find yourself working in the remote places of Alaska during the polar night, remember this story. When the darkness presses down like a living weight and strange dreams fill your sleep, dawn, to trust the voices that promise escape. Dawn, to follow the figures you glimpse in your peripheral vision. And whatever you do, don't to look too closely at your own reflection. Because once the Ajupini marks you as prey, it never stops hunting. And eventually, you'll discover that the only thing worse than being consumed by the hunger that walks is becoming the hunger that walks. Trust me on this, I can feel it happening already. Story 10, Lost Patrol. The vanished Mounties 4 men entered the Yukon wilderness in 1911, and something else came out wearing their faces. My name is Detective Ray Kowalski with the Alaska State Troopers. And what I'm about to tell you happened during a joint investigation with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police last winter. We thought we were solving a century-old mystery about 4 missing officers who vanished during a routine patrol. We had no idea we were walking into a nightmare that should have stayed buried in the frozen wasteland where it began. The case started with a hiker finding human remains near the Forty Mile River, about 60 miles southeast of Eagle, Alaska. The bones were old, weathered by decades of harsh winters, but they were arranged in a way that suggested something more sinister than natural death. The skeleton was positioned upright against a tree, arms crossed over the chest, as if someone had taken great care to give the deceased a proper burial pose. What made the discovery truly unusual were the artifacts scattered around the remains. A brass button from an early 20th century Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniform. Fragments of leather that might have been cavalry boots. And most intriguing, a tarnished badge bearing the serial number of Constable Samuel Carter, one of 4 Mounties who disappeared without a trace in February 1911. The Lost Patrol, as they came to be known, had been attempting to establish a winter route between Fort McPherson and Dawson City when they vanished into the Yukon Territory. Inspector Francis Fitzgerald, Constable George Kinney, Constable Richard Taylor, and Constable Samuel Carter left Fort McPherson with enough supplies for a 30-day journey and were never seen alive again. Search parties eventually found their remains the following spring, but the official story never made complete sense. The bodies were scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness, suggesting the men had become separated and died individually of starvation and exposure. But experienced Mounties didn't just get lost and wander off in different directions. They were trained for exactly these conditions. The Canadian government asked us to investigate the new remains as a courtesy, since they were found on the American side of the border. What should have been a routine forensic examination turned into something that challenged everything I thought I understood about death, time, and the things that hunt in the darkest corners of the world. I flew to Eagle on a Tuesday morning in November, when the first serious snowfall was already coating the mountains in white. Eagle is barely a town, maybe 87 people living in a collection of log cabins and trailer homes where the Yukon River crosses from Canada into Alaska. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, it's business, and strangers are noticed immediately. My contact was Sergeant Marie Dubois of the RCMP, a veteran investigator who had driven down from Whitehorse to coordinate the joint effort. She was waiting at Eagle, this tiny airstrip with a four-wheel drive truck loaded with camping gear and enough supplies for a week in the backcountry. Marie had been researching the Lost Patrol case for years as a personal project, fascinated by the inconsistencies in the official record. She interviewed elders in native communities across the Yukon, collecting oral histories that painted a very different picture from the government reports. According to these accounts, the four Mounties had encountered something in the wilderness that wasn't entirely human. The drive to the discovery site took us through country that looked like the end of the world. Endless miles of snow-covered forest broken by frozen rivers and mountains that scraped the belly of gray clouds. The few mining claims and hunting cabins we passed looked abandoned, their windows dark and their driveways unplowed. We made camp near the 40 Mile River as the sun was setting, which happened around 4 in the afternoon at that latitude in November. The darkness that followed was absolute, the kind of black that seemed to have weight and texture. Our campfire created a small bubble of warmth and light, but beyond that circle lay an ocean of cold that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. Marie showed me photocopies of the original search reports while we ate dinner from military-style ration packs. The documents were heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out by government censors. But what remained told a story of increasing desperation and fear among the searchers. Multiple search parties had reported finding tracks that didn't match any known animal or human foot pattern. Campsites showed evidence of hasty abandonment, as if the occupants had fled from something approaching in the night. Most disturbing were the witness statements from native guides who refused to continue after encountering what they described as voices calling from empty forest. The first night passed without incident, but I woke up feeling like I'd been watched while I slept. The sensation was so strong that I spent several minutes checking the perimeter of our camp with a flashlight, looking for tracks or signs of intrusion. I found nothing, but the feeling lingered throughout the following day. We reached the discovery site around noon, a grove of stunted spruce trees about half a mile from the river. The skeleton had been removed by the coroner's office, but the area was still marked with evidence flags and survey stakes. Marie walked me through the scene, pointing out details that hadn't made it into the official reports. The ground around the tree showed signs of disturbance that extended in a rough circle about 20 feet in diameter. Not the random scuffing you'd expect from scavengers or natural decomposition, but deliberate patterns that looked almost ritualistic. Straight lines carved into the frozen earth, intersecting at precise angles, as if someone had been drawing symbols with supernatural significance. More troubling were the other trees in the grove. Each one bore carved marks that looked fresh despite the age of the wood, symbols that matched nothing in any known indigenous art or European tradition. The carvings seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water and my head ache. Marie had brought a metal detector to search for additional artifacts, and we spent hours combing the area for anything the original investigators might have missed. The device remained silent until we reached a depression about 50 yards from the main site, where it began screaming with electronic fury. We dug through 2 feet of frozen soil and forest debris before hitting something metallic. It was another RCMP badge, this one belonging to Constable Richard Taylor. But unlike the tarnished brass of Carter's badge, this one looked brand new, as if it had been buried yesterday instead of over a century ago. Beneath the badge was a leather journal wrapped in oiled cloth, preserved so perfectly that the pages were still readable. The handwriting inside was cramped and frantic, the words of a man slowly losing his grip on reality. It was Taylor's diary, chronicling the final days of the Lost Patrol in horrifying detail. According to the journal, the four Mounties had indeed become lost during a blizzard, but their troubles began long before they died of exposure. They encountered something in the wilderness that followed them for weeks, always staying just outside the range of their vision but making its presence known through sounds and tracks. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to be studying them, learning their behavior patterns and mimicking their voices. Taylor wrote about hearing Inspector Fitzgerald calling for help from the forest, only to find the man asleep in his bedroll when he investigated. Constable Kinney reported similar incidents, claiming that something was using their own voices to confuse and separate them. As the weeks passed and their supplies dwindled, the psychological pressure intensified. The creature began appearing in their peripheral vision, always in the form of one of their companions. Taylor would see Carter gathering firewood, only to realize that Carter was standing right beside him. Kinney would spot Fitzgerald scouting ahead, then turn to find the inspector behind him with no memory of leaving the group. The final entries in the journal descended into pure madness. Taylor became convinced that one or more of his companions had been replaced by the creature, writing paranoid accusations against men he'd known and trusted for years. The last coherent entry described a plan to separate from the group and continue alone, believing it was the only way to escape whatever was hunting them. But the most disturbing detail was saved for the final page. Taylor claimed that the creature had begun speaking to him directly, promising warmth and food if he would just stop running and accept what was happening. The thing allegedly told him that it was lonely, that it had been waiting in the wilderness for decades for someone to keep it company. All he had to do was stop fighting, and the pain would end. The journal ended abruptly, but Marie had found something even more unsettling in her research. According to indigenous oral histories, search parties had found the four Mounties alive the following spring, not dead as the official reports claimed. The men had walked out of the wilderness after months of being missing, apparently unharmed but fundamentally changed. They couldn't remember details of their ordeal, claiming no knowledge of how they survived the brutal winter without adequate supplies. Medical examinations found them to be in perfect health despite months of supposed starvation and exposure. But family members and fellow officers noticed subtle differences in their behavior, as if they were playing roles rather than being themselves. All four men resigned from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police within a year of their return, citing personal reasons and desires to pursue other careers. They scattered to different parts of Canada and were never seen again, as if they simply vanished for a second time. Marie believed that whatever the Lost Patrol encountered in 1911 had somehow replaced them, sending duplicates back to civilization while keeping the original men prisoner in the wilderness. The recent discovery of skeletal remains suggested that the real Mounties had been held captive for decades before finally dying of old age or worse. We spent another day at the site, documenting everything we could find and collecting soil samples for laboratory analysis. But as evening approached, I began experiencing the same sensation of being watched that had plagued me the previous night. This time, Marie felt it too, constantly turning to look over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone approaching through the trees. The attack came just after sunset. We were preparing dinner when we heard voices calling from the forest, men shouting for help in what sounded like the accents of early 20th century Canada. The voices were distant but clear, echoing through the trees with desperate urgency. Marie grabbed her flashlight and started toward the sound, but I caught her arm and held her back. Something about the voices was wrong. They were too clear for the distance they seemed to be coming from, and they repeated the same phrases over and over like recordings stuck on loop. This wasn't people calling for help. It was something else using stolen voices to lure us into the darkness. The voices circled our campsite for over an hour, always staying just outside the range of our flashlight beams. Sometimes they sounded like men in distress, other times like children playing games, occasionally like women singing lullabies. But underneath all the different voices was the same artificial quality, as if a single intelligence was cycling through a collection of stolen sounds. When the vocal mimicry finally stopped, the physical manifestations began. Shadows moved between the trees, human-shaped figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They approached our camp in groups of 4, always maintaining the same spacing and formation, like soldiers on patrol. I drew my service weapon and ordered the figures to identify themselves, but they continued advancing without any response. Marie had her own sidearm ready, but we both knew that bullets would be useless against whatever was coming for us. These weren't living people. They were something else wearing the shapes of people, and they wanted us to join their eternal patrol through the frozen wilderness. The confrontation lasted until dawn, with the shadow figures maintaining their patient siege while we huddled by our fire and tried not to let fear overwhelm rational thinking. As the first pale light began filtering through the trees, the entities faded away like smoke and wind, leaving no tracks or other evidence of their presence. We broke camp immediately and drove back to Eagle without stopping, both of us too shaken to discuss what we experienced. The drive passed in tense silence, with frequent checks of the rearview mirror to make sure nothing was following us. The official report I filed classified the investigation as inconclusive due to insufficient evidence. The skeletal remains were identified as belonging to an unknown historical figure, possibly a prospector or trapper from the early 1900s. Taylor's journal was quietly transferred to government archives and marked classified for national security reasons. But Marie and I knew the truth. The Lost Patrol was still out there, transformed into something that hunted other travelers in the Yukon wilderness. The four Mounties had become part of whatever ancient force dwelled in that frozen wasteland, condemned to recruit new members for their ghostly regiment. I resigned from the Alaska State Troopers 3 months after returning from Eagle, unable to concentrate on routine police work after what I witnessed. Marie transferred to a desk job in Ottawa, claiming she was too old for fieldwork but really running from memories that haunted her dreams. We stay in touch through encrypted emails, sharing reports of missing hikers and unexplained disappearances in the Yukon Territory. The pattern is always the same: experienced outdoors people vanishing without a trace, search parties finding no evidence of their fate, occasional reports of voices calling from empty forest. The Lost Patrol is still recruiting, still adding to their numbers one victim at a time. And somewhere in the frozen wilderness between Fort McPherson and Dawson City, something that was once 4 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers continues its eternal patrol, waiting for the next travelers foolish enough to venture into their domain. If you ever find yourself in the Yukon during winter, remember this story. If you hear voices calling from the forest, don't investigate. If you see figures moving between the trees, don't follow. And whatever you do, don't let them separate you from your companions. Because once the Lost Patrol marks you as a recruit, they never stop hunting. And the only way to escape their eternal service is to never enter their territory in the first place.